MVC and Ajax are a perfect combination in MVC4. Ajax is seen as a miracle technology, which is pretty good because it's JavaScript and XML working together to perform some instantaneous client-side calls. This is way better than HTML and plain JavaScript ever was back in the day. And this is because Ajax runs in the browser and makes calls to the server. It uses the standard-based technologies that are widely deployed in today's web browsers and environments. All modern browsers do implement the XHTTP request, which is the form of the request that the Ajax makes. So when you do a jQuery call or using old JavaScript to make a call to a server, in our case an MVC method, you can return a JSON response or XML response. They both come back with data that you provide, whether that's a Boolean or you're actually passing back an array of data. jQuery can vastly improve your user interface, and this is from wiring up events like on-click events, showing and hiding things, as well as using some of the widgets like from the jQuery UI, like their accordions or their tab technology and so forth. Also, there are differences between the web and desktop applications. For instance, desktop, everything's kind of self-inclusive. It's right there. It runs kind of like a single-page application in some cases, and it's really instantaneous, where the web is pretty much everything's a hack. You know, HTML is the basis, and then anything beyond a normal form post that posts back to the server and reloads the page. Anything else after that is pretty much a hack, to say it bluntly. But you know, we can really format that well by using jQuery and JavaScript and other class libraries. So Ajax definitely feels faster. It reduces the load on the server just because it's instantaneous and it's just going to get a little piece of data. It's not reloading or asking for the full page again. And also it's inherently asynchronous. So it can sit there and not make full server calls, just say, hey, give me just this data. That's all I need. Here are some possible problems with Ajax. It requires JavaScript to be enabled, which it's hard to believe, but still in some cases JavaScript has been disabled for security threats and other things. A user can't use a back button by default with JavaScript. A user can't bookmark a page state with JavaScript. JavaScript, if it's loaded and not minified, can possibly bloat a page if there's too much of it for downloading. And historically JavaScript has been slow, although there have been great strides made in terms of minification and obfuscation to increase JavaScript's load times with many websites. MVC and Ajax together make a great combination. This is basically an opposites attraction, where MVC is the server technology and Ajax is entirely in the browser, even though it does make calls to the browser. But here are some nice synergies between them. MVC includes features to help implement Ajax, while Ajax can interact with action methods that are within the MVC controllers. In some cases, little or no JavaScript is required to be written to make this happen. Ajax and jQuery in MVC4 bring some new things to the table. First off, all the old Microsoft Ajax libraries that were used in MVC3 and before are now deprecated. Microsoft has fully moved to jQuery, which is a good thing for a lot of us that have adopted jQuery for many years with our web applications. Also, it is a third-party open source project, so that means that there's constant community development for this. Also, it's a concise JavaScript library that's also lightweight. It has a core set of features, and it's a robust plugin model, just like jQuery is. Also, Microsoft has full support in this. It includes jQuery with MVC and Visual Studio. It also supports incidents, and it's contributing features and plugins for this. Also, there's interoperability between jQuery and all of the ASP.NET files. The jQuery files that are included with your MVC template, as shown over here on the right side, are 3 versions of our most files. Most of them are any star.js files, minified files, and our VS-Doc files, which help out for the IntelliSense. Here are the files as they are listed over on the right. Here we have jQuery 1.7, which is what is shipped with MVC4. The jQuery UI 1.8.2 is also shipped with MVC4, as well as unobtrusive Ajax and validate.js. If you notice on the right, there's also two other additional libraries. There's Knockout and then there's Modernizer. Knockout is included in the MVC4 web application by default. It's an MVVM model, or model view model, for the UI. This uses declarative bindings and dependency tracking and templates to help pass data from the server to the UI and then back to the server, all through keeping track of it on the UI. Modernizer, on the other hand, is also included in the web application, but this detects native CSS3 and HTML5 features, and this is great for building websites with emerging features of HTML5. Both of these libraries are included by default but are not turned on with your web application, but are easily done so by including them in your bundle config within the app start folder. When dealing with JavaScript files, the use of a content delivery network is highly encouraged because these are geographically distributed sets of servers that host and deliver content from around the world. For instance, if you have a person in California and you have a person over in New York, and you have one server between them and it just happens to sit in New York, well, the person in New York will technically get their data faster and more consistently than the person in California. Where a CDN will be involved is you would have a server that represents the East Coast and then a server that represents the West Coast, where the person in California would receive their data from the West Coast server opposed to trying to go across the states all the way over to New York to get that server as well. The biggest CDNs are actually from Google and Microsoft, and a lot of the benefits are that they provide the bandwidth for you, so you're not trying to serve up the same jQuery libraries, for instance, that they can provide for you. A browser can catch files and use across all the sites that you have. The CDN is geographically dispersed, as I mentioned, to reduce latency. To take advantage of a CDN's network really means to put your website to make it as fast as possible. Because if you're serving up the same files that are freely available on Google and Microsoft CDN network, then you're not taking advantage of some speed that is rightly available to you. Both CDNs from Google and Microsoft host the latest and some prior versions. So in some cases you could actually tell it to go get the latest to whatever jQuery and automatically pull it down into your web application. But that's probably not the best scenario, because sometimes with some version updates, some things do change and could possibly break your web application. So using a CDN, we'll look at a few examples here on how to call that. First, we'll start with Microsoft. Here we have a normal script source tag like we would as if the file was located locally. But what's different here is that we're actually calling a full URL of the ajax.aspnetcdn.com/ajax and so forth to the actual jQuery file name. And notice that we're actually calling a specific version of the jQuery file. This is, like I mentioned, where we don't want to necessarily get the latest, but we want to get a version that we know works with our web application. Here's the same thing from Google. As you know, they're pretty similar, the difference being the actual URL. Google's URL is ajax.googleapis.com, but essentially is the same file that's being pulled down. The files hosted do actually differ within here. And they don't always immediately upload the latest version just because jQuery.com has posted the latest version out there. It doesn't mean Microsoft and Google will be hopping on the bandwagon too quickly to actually go make those publicly available. Unobtrusive JavaScript is what Microsoft.ajax has bowed down to for MVC4. So some of the main principles of unobtrusive JavaScript are this true separation of functionality. And there's also best practices to use so that your validation that occurs on your view pages is instantaneous and controlled by an app setting in your web config. Also, there's progressive enhancement. So as web browsers get smarter with HTML5 and CSS3, unobtrusive JavaScript takes advantage of these. However, if you have someone with an older browser visiting your website, then unobtrusive JavaScript still can be written to the page, but the older browser will just simply ignore it. So here's some examples of some of our separation of functionality that I just mentioned. This is probably one of the most important features of unobtrusive JavaScript. Here's an example of an obtrusive JavaScript that really would get in the way of somebody that had JavaScript disabled or cannot do this in a browser. Here we have an input text box that has an explicit onChange event that's calling a JavaScript validate date. Now what would happen is that if JavaScript was disabled, this form field would not work correctly. Here's the unobtrusive JavaScript version. First we remove the onChange and use a script element to wire up the event. The separation of content and behavior comes here. Here we have the same input box, but notice we're not calling a JavaScript onChange event, but we would wire in a separate script tag the actual validate date JavaScript function to look at this event. This allows the same kind of separation of content and formatting with CSS involved on this page. So this means that this page will load correctly regardless if JavaScript is enabled or not, although some of the functionality with JavaScript being disabled would not work correctly, but the page would not break. So what happens when JavaScript is disabled? Well, users can turn off JavaScript by default, and this is bad if your site totally depends on JavaScript. So that's where unobtrusive JavaScript comes into play, because we need to degrade the site gracefully if it's not enabled. We provide information another way that is not via JavaScript, and at least we notify users certain features are not available if they have JavaScript disabled. X requested with HTTP header actually is a way to detect whether scripts are on or off. This works with both the header and content areas. So there are ways to gracefully fail or gracefully degrade a web application that heavily depends on JavaScript, but you still want to be able to serve that web application at least in an altered state for people that do not have JavaScript enabled by default. In this demo, we're going to be looking at what it's like to degrade your view page when JavaScript is not enabled on a client browser. I know this day and age it's hard to believe that some browsers do not or will not take JavaScript, but these are things that people can turn off, or could be a policy set by an administrator on a network, preventing their end users from potentially getting some bad stuff come across any pages that they're viewing. So let's go ahead and run this application that I've loaded, and I'm going to choose Firefox in here in Visual Studio. If you have it installed, you can see the selections as well as Google Chrome and Internet Explorer by default. But here you can select Firefox and automatically tell it to open up in Firefox. So this is our dog app again. It's got a few extra pieces on here that deal with Ajax in JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and click on JavaScript version 1. I'm just going to type in something and click search. And you notice without the page refreshing, it automatically returned what I just typed in. Now, because I'm using Firefox, I've got an add-on called NoScript that will allow me to turn off JavaScripting altogether within Firefox. This can be done in the other browsers like Internet Explorer, Google, and so forth, but that's multi-step. So here, this is one step, very easy, and you don't want me to do that in front of you and make you sit there. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and turn off JavaScript. So now JavaScript has been disabled. So if I try to execute this again without even reloading the page, my whole page just went away, and all it knew what to do was to return the string that I sent it. Now this happens because of the way our Ajax result is set up. So let's look at what the post looks like for test.js1 within our controller. So let's go ahead and stop our build. We'll go into Home Controller, scroll down to test.js1. There's our HTTP GET. Here's our post. So all it's doing is returning a search string like that. That's all it knows how to do. It's just returning a string saying, here you go, here's what you put in, here you go. Now, when JavaScript was enabled, doing Ajax, this worked and just appended to the page that it was on. However, when JavaScript was not enabled, it just returned this as the entire page and nothing else was there. So let's take a look at why that was. So let's open up our view for this, test.js1. It's under Home. Should have test.js1 here. Make sure that gets open. Okay. So here we have our ajax.begin form, which is pointing to our test.js1 method. And we're passing in a few Ajax options, and we're saying, basically on success, if you will, update the target ID of search results, which that's a div down here, titled search results. So that's saying we know we're going to get a string back essentially, because that's what this method is doing right here. So we know we're getting a string back. So let's go populate that string in this div here marked as search results. So this is pretty much where the problem lies. When there's no scripting going on this page, all the browser knows how to do is just display the raw string that it gets back from the controller. Because this page is dependent on JavaScript in order to execute correctly and have the layout page, along with all the other fixings of the view. So if script is disabled, this page will not work as designed. So let's go ahead and run this again, and I'll show you some features of what's going on behind the scenes of this page when Ajax is enabled. Okay, so let's make sure that we allow scripting. We'll go back into our test JavaScript page, and I'm just going to right click on the page and do a view source. I'm going to scroll down to our form section. So here we have our form. The action is set to home/test.js1, which that will hit our method that's providing us our string data back. Here we have some data attributes that are HTML5, and we have an Ajax update, which is saying update the search results element. Post automatically put in there, and it's automatically given the ID of form 0 because we did not specify a particular form. There's our input box, and there's our submit button right there. Now you notice that if you're used to seeing former versions of MVC, normally you would have like an on-click event here, whereas we don't now. And this is because it's basically been upgraded to HTML5 equivalent attributes that run along with the jQuery unobtrusive Ajax, which you see right up here, which has replaced the Microsoft Ajax from previous versions of MVC. So what also happens is that because we're trying to update on Ajax, our search results div, it doesn't know what to do because when scripting is turned off, these data attributes here do not get passed through. So that because you need scripting in order for those to work. So that's just that example there. And there are other things that if you are using Firefox, and you can use Firebug within it and to see what's actually going on. When you do an Ajax request, you can use Firebug, which also has built in under the net category an XHR, which stands for XML HTTP request. Anytime you do like an Ajax request, you can actually see what's being posted in the backend and see what type of response it's actually getting. So here, now that we have scripting enabled, I'm just going to pass in some stuff. I'll hit search. And you notice down here under the XHR, it has a post here saying what happened. Let me make this a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on here. It's showing all the header information from our response, timestamps, so forth. One thing to point out is down here is that we're showing how it was requested. So this was actually an XHR request, which is right here. Pretty much means it's Ajax request, and that's that. So we can see what was actually posted. So again, here's our XML HTTP request, or XHR for short. That's what we passed through, and this is actually what the string kind of looked like behind the scenes. So, but the second part here, the second variable, x-requested-with, is a variable that we're actually going to be looking at in our controller to see how things are being passed, because we can handle it differently in our controller. So let's let's stop this, and let's go over to our controller, and we can take a look at how we can handle that with another test here for test JS2. So here we have this extra method, JS2, which the HTTP GET method, not exciting at all. There's nothing really there other than to display the view, which is right here. But back in our controller, we have the post method, which is looking for the string search, just like our other first one is. But here we are assigning a Boolean variable is Ajax request to equal the result of a request.form variable, the x-requested-with, or if there's a header with the same name. If either one of those is true, then it's going to return the content via Ajax search string along with what you typed in. Otherwise, it's going to do a redirect to action to another view, or to the to this JS view, and pass in the data for search string to the view. This would ensure that if the script is not an Ajax request, that it tries to reload the entire view regardless if scripting is enabled or not. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and see how it works. So let's go into our test JavaScript version 2. We'll type in stuff. So there's our Ajax search string, which we're telling that to come back right here. So that ran through this first guy because that was an Ajax request. So now let's turn off scripting, and we will try search again. So now notice it came back search string stuff. So just to show that I am not making this up and there are no smoke and mirrors, I'm going to put a breakpoint on here. So then we can watch it run again. More stuff. So here we have our string of more stuff coming into play here. And then as we step through it, our first setup here is setting up the Boolean is Ajax request, looking for the requested form, requested with, or if there are headers, requested with as well. So if I actually copy that right there and go to our immediate window, so that's currently null. I bet the other one is as well. Back to our immediate window, take off that. And again, that's also null. So that is going to come back false, which it is. So then it automatically goes to our redirect action of the same view name. So what this does is this ensures, being an action result, that we're going to return a view opposed to returning just a string like we did before in test JS1. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. And there we have our string of more stuff. Now let's go ahead, while we have our breakpoint set up, turn back on scripting, and we'll even say even more stuff. Let's do our search. Again, we come into our action result, come into play here, and if we just look at our immediate window, our requested headers are null. However, we do have a request form that's coming across as XAML HTTP request. So this should end up being true, which it is. And here we return just the content of our Ajax search string. I'll go ahead and let it run. And there we go. So now let's go ahead and close Firefox, and we'll stop our debugging. While this is working for us and works great, there is a slightly better way to deal with this part right here, where we're doing the request form, or looking for the request form and request headers, if you will. So just below here, I have commented out the actual better way to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this, and I will comment out the long way of doing this. So here, instead of setting up a isAjaxRequest boolean and doing the lookup for the request form, request headers, Microsoft has built in request.isAjaxRequest, which returns the same thing, a boolean that you can key off of to say if it's an Ajax string or if it's something else. So I'll go ahead, save this, and we'll run it. It's always nice doing a shorthand version of things like that, but the power of it is knowing about it. So if you're not sure about something, feel free to do a search on the internet, and chances are you'll probably end up on stackoverflow.com and somebody else has searched for it. So again, here's our Ajax search string stuff. We'll quickly turn it off. So we turned off scripting. I'll say more stuff. There we go. So that is the non-Ajax way of getting that via our shorthand. So this has been an example of one way to degrade gracefully when JavaScript is not enabled in your browser and still have a decent user experience. Even though you could say, hey, enable JavaScript, you'll have a much, much, much better experience than not.